So for it to be selectively permeable, otherwise, if it wasn't, the contents, the exterior of a cell and the interior of the cell would be exactly the same. So we know that that can't happen. So even some of your organelles have to maintain a certain balance within the organelle. So when we think of the cell membrane, we just think of the interface between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. But y'all, your organelles, all those membrane-bound organelles, they also have cell membranes. And they have proteins. And so they also have an exchange between the cytoplasm and the inside of an organelle. So a lot of what we talk about is true even within an organelle. Lysosomes, for example, have to stay a pH of 5. So they have proteins that literally pump hydrogen into the lysosome to maintain a pH of 5. And all those hydrogens come from something that's been knocked off from some chemical reaction. So it's wild that all these chemical reactions are taking place, and we never, ever would know anything. We would be none the wiser. So the cell membrane does a lot of this actively and passively. So it's choosy. Is that right? Is it with, or with the E?
It's with the E.
Okay, I'm a terrible speller. Okay, there we go. So choosy, selectively permeable. So what's going to control which way things move, do you think? What's going to decide which way things move? Like with the lungs, what decided which way the oxygen went, which way the CO2 went? The areola. Okay, so do you think it just said, hey, can I come in? Or do you think it just automatically went the direction it was supposed to go? So what caused it was a concentration gradient, okay? So the movement of molecules is determined by concentration gradient is called. So what is a gradient? Let's say you're going to do a gradient of color.
Like the darkest to lightest.
Right.
Like
Yeah, different amounts, right? So it starts from like a least amount to a greater amount. So that's what this is. And concentration, we're not talking about a light gradient or a color gradient. We're talking about a concentration gradient. And that means between, a lot of times it's the inside and the outside of the cell, okay? Or between two spaces. So I'm going to put between two spaces. Okay, so with that, and let's just use the lung as an example. So let's say this is an alveolar sac, and here's the bloodstream. Okay, so what is, when you inhale, where do we have the most oxygen? Inside the lung. Okay, so that is an alveolar sac of lungs. Oops, stop. Okay, so we're going to fill it full of oxygen. So that's a concentration gradient right there. We have more oxygen inside than we do outside, between this space and this space. So because of that, we're going to find out that it doesn't like to be in a crowded space. It likes to be where it has plenty of room. So it's like when you get into an elevator and you're like, oh, I don't want to get in that crowded elevator, but I really need to get going. So you move into an elevator and there's like 6 other people in there. And then it stops on the next floor and 2 more people get in there. And now it's getting hot. People are getting kind of antsy. And it's like, can you just hurry? And so when it's crowded, those molecules don't like to be like that. So they want to be able to move to a lower concentration to where they have more space. So that's what happens. This oxygen diffuses, like what Francis said earlier, to a lower concentration. And when it does, then you have that movement just because it's not equal. All right, so what did we say there's a lot of out here in the bloodstream? So these little red blood cells, what are they bringing? The hemoglobin has carbon dioxide. So let's say I'm going to put CO2 in those. Now we have another concentration gradient. So because we have more CO2 on the outside, which way is it going to move?
inside.
Yeah. So that is diffusion also. So there's an exchange just because it's trying to reach what's called an equilibrium. We don't want it to be equal because if it's equal, our pulse ox is going to be way too low and that's not good for our cells. So at any given time, we want to have a really, really, really high oxygen content. So if you have some lung failure and people have some lung issues, they have to struggle with that. And they may need some extra help. So that just explains what a concentration gradient is. Also, solute size. So just like what I showed yesterday with those balls, if it's a big solute size, it can't pass through the membrane, can't get through. So solute size limits what can pass. So I want you to remember, tell me what are some other big molecules? Like if this is starch, then what would this be? What is the monomer of starch? So this is a big starch, and this is the monomer. Say it louder. Somebody said it. What's the smallest carb? Monosaccharide. And most of the time we just have a glucose. So we're going to say this is glucose. Here's a starch. So glucose, still decent size, 24 atoms, but it can pass through. It may just take a little bit longer. Starch, really, really big. Okay, what if this is a protein and this is an amino acid? What's going to be able to pass through? Exactly. So think about that because we're going to do a little skit just a second. Okay. Let's see. So let's pass through membrane. Okay. So that's two factors that are going to decide which way things go. So what we're talking about is cell transport. Okay. So transport is, what does trans mean? Across, right? Moving something across, whatever's attached to the word. So you're moving it across transatlantic or translation or transportation or whatever Asian. We're moving something. So in this case, we can do this two ways. So this is moving molecules or moving substances between a cell and its environment with or without the use of ATP. So do you think the fact that diffusion has taken place, are you actively having to use more ATP? I'm not talking about you moving the inhale, exhale part. I'm just talking about the gas exchange. Do you think it just does it on its own and moves across the membrane without your brain saying you need to move across the membrane or use some more ATP to pump it across the membrane? Do you think it just moves across on its own? It actually does. It does. It happens automatically. And so that's what we call passive transport. We're going to pause for a minute and do this little skit. So this speaks to the selective nature of the cell membrane. All right, so I need two guys. All right, Charlie, here, guys. I'm going to let you do the other one. Y'all are the bouncers at Club Cell. There you go. Right. You go, Billy. Get out. Can you stop? Do you have a hot pass? I do. Okay, so here's your little name tag. All right, put that on your shirt. Okay. Now, what I need y'all to do, this is inside Club Cell. This is outside Club Cell. And y'all are the two bouncers are going to be right here, okay? And you have to check everybody's ID.
Miss Thornhill?
This is who is on the VIP list. All right, so y'all have to check out the list first.
I'm just going to put this What the fuck is in the bag?
Okay. So now I need some volunteers. You have to be patrons. You're going to come to the club. And they're going to tell you if you're allowed. All right, need one more person. All right, so everybody except Destiny. Destiny is going to have to stay in. She's going to leave the cell when she gets done with club cell. But everybody else, y'all have to be out here. You're in line to get in. Okay.
Where's the VIP?
Here you are. You're on surveillance. There you go. All right, you have to go out in the hallway. Yeah, this is club sale. You can't run in here.
You gotta show me this.
You're too good at your job.
Okay. All right, so what you're going to do is we want them to show everybody their tag, okay? And then, yeah, you can tell them, yeah, you can come in and reject them.
No.
All right, hold it so we can see it. You got to hold it up here so we can see it. Hold it all the way up. Cellulose. All right, she got rejected. Okay. Hold it. All right, what's that one?
Glucose.
All right. Okay. What is yours?
I made it.
Oh, yes. Who got rejected? No one. Oh,
No way. Where's it?
you're trying to get in.
I want to get in. We got to bounce them? I got to push you too, bro. On in. Jesus Christ.
All right, whoa. All right, stop. All right, Dominic, you got to go back out.
He's going to kill ourselves.
You're going to you're not the hole in the cell, dude.
No.
Not a Charlie and Tosh.
You knocked off my name.
All right, so now Destiny.
I got that.
What's that?
CO2.
I knew I was going to get rejected.
Okay, all right, so now y'all come on in. Y'all, everybody come in. Let's see if we can figure out what the
CO2 leave.
pattern was.
How you gonna tell me when she told me to leave?
I'm just saying what's on the card.
You know what's funny? You know what's funny? I knew I was going to leave. I mean, I knew I was going to get rejected.
All right.
I don't write the list. I just enforce it.
There you go. You don't make up the rules. You just enforce it. That's right. All right. Don't take.
I'm wearing this whole. I knew Stark was not going to get in, but he tried.
Okay. He was. Okay. So, why was some things able to get in and others not? Why? Cellulose. Who was not allowed in? Starch, cellulose, protein.
Protein not allowed in.
Are those monomers or polymers?
Monomers?
Did you really record it?
Couldn't get through. So, but if we can break you down and make you smaller, digest you, then you could get in. So Destiny that had ended up kicking out. She was unruly. She was carbon dioxide. She had to get out. But oxygen could come in. So so that's the whole selective nature business. Now, if that's always true if the cell membrane really worked as well as these guys worked at being the bouncers at the club, then you would never get sick. But we know that cell membrane's not perfect and things happen.
And
So-
some people are persistent.
Right. And you know what? The flu is pretty persistent. And we have other viruses and bacteria that are too. Okay. All right. So let's look at two kinds. And then you guys are going to formulate your own skits today. And you're going to act something out. You have to write your own little skit today. Okay. All right. So two categories of transport. About food protein transport.
Can I ask what you do with the recordings?
They're on YouTube.
Oh,
So that's where the notes are. So they're on my channel. So that way, if you ever want to go back and look at a lecture or something like that, like if people are or absent.
What do you think?
I want to know how many times I've been there.
Okay. So we have two categories, and I've kind of separated them out because we're going to spend time over here, and this is what you're going to act out. So we really kind of did because we set up diffusion and osmosis with that skit right there. You're going to, ooh, all right. So passive versus active, which one is going to use ATP?
Active.
No.
Active ATP. You use energy when you're active, and you're passive. You're just kind of chill and just laid back, and you're really not using a whole lot of energy. So passive transport doesn't use ATP. To move molecules through the membrane. And this one does. So it's pretty easy to remember ATP active, okay? So ATP to literally pump molecules against their natural flow. So if they want to go one way, you're going to make them go the other way. So it's a little bit like what was happening with Dominic. I mean, Dominic, boy, he was wanting to come in, but they were like, oh no, brother, you're going out. And so they had to use a lot of ATP to do that. So, okay. Go with the flow. Okay, so passive transport, there's three kinds. We're going to look at two, and we're going to show a couple different ways that are some real life ways that this happens. But we already know it happens right now with your lungs between your bloodstream. But the first is diffusion. Okay. All right, diffusion, and this is moving molecules or substances from a high concentration. So just like with the lungs where there's more oxygen, it's going to go from there to where there's less, or more CO2 from there where there's less. High concentration, where it's crowded. To a lower concentration. And of course, without ATP because it's passive. All right. So these are going to be moving smaller molecules, but not water. We give water a special name, diffusion of water. So smaller molecules like salts, glucose, though it's bigger, it still can come through. Oxygen, CO2. Those are some examples. Okay. But this happens also not just between cells. So diffusion, a good example, had like a fart blossom kid in second period. And yeah, just, he was honest. He was like, hey, can I go outside? I was like, diffusion. So that's an example. Burning a candle, burnt popcorn, spraying perfume or cologne, and right around you can smell it, but maybe across the room you can't smell it yet. Molecules are moving and it diffuses to the other side. So all the molecules, think about that elevator, they all want to have their own space and be able to move around and be spread out. And that's what diffusion is. So can you think of another example of diffusion? Just a regular everyday one?
Like tea or
Tea or coffee, yeah, absolutely. Put a tea bag in hot water, it diffuses into the water. Yep. Well, oil mix. Oh, like in a diffuser, yeah, because it's put with water droplets and it's put into the air, right? And as it comes out, then it diffuses in the room. Yeah. Yep. So those are some examples of diffusion. And then here is osmosis. And the pictures we're going to draw will include both. Okay, so osmosis is the diffusion of water. Yep. And this is how you remember it. O for osmosis, H2O, and water. Okay, so that if they're talking about movement of water, unless they're saying you have to pump it against the flow, it's always going to be osmosis. So here's a couple examples, and you're going to have to act out a couple of these. Like each group will get one example you have to make like a little skit for. Okay, so the first one is a slug. So draw you like a little juicy slug. Okay, and slugs have antennae and they have their eyeballs are at the tip of their antennae. So that's what those are, little eyelashes. Slugs are a good 90% full of water. So lots and lots of water. They're nice and juicy. So nice and juicy.
The salt.
All right, so we're gonna put some salt. Actually, I need to use a different color. That way I can see it better. So we're gonna load it up with some salt. Okay, so where do you have a higher concentration of salt? On the outside of the slug or the inside of the slug? Okay, so which way is the salt going to diffuse? Right, so the rule is high to low, go with the flow. So it's like, oh, salt's going, I'm moving on in. So it's trying to move on in. It's probably going to cut off if we're doing this all day.
You just be solitary.
No. That's diffusion. Okay, so if salt diffuses in, which way is the water going to move? Out. It's going to dehydrate the cells, right? So that's osmosis. So water is going to leave. Now, don't make the people will say, oh, it's going to move up or it's going to move down. I'm like, well, it's not. Maybe in the diagram it looks that way, but it's just going to leave the cells or it's going to enter the cells. So this is osmosis. So in a solution where we have a whole lot of solute, it's called hypertonic. Okay, so hyper a lot. So here's another one. So what's going to happen to this little slug?
Dry out.
Yeah. So
Do bugs have feelings?
no. There you go. All right. So a slug's life. Okay. Next. Let's do a grape. Okay. So here's a grape. Now grapes have a lot of residual sugar inside of them, tons of sugar. So you've got sugar inside, but you also have lots and lots of water. Okay. So let's say that we put some that sugary sour mix, like those raisins they have in the cafeteria. So we're going to put a bunch of that sour sugar mix stuff on the outside of it. Okay, so they're going to take all these grapes and they're going to dump all that sugary, soury mixed stuff on top of them. What's going to happen?
Yeah.
All right, so tell me in terms of diffusion and osmosis. Which way is things going to move? Which way?
The water is out.
All right, so where do you have more sugar, salt stuff?
Outside.
Yeah, no, we do have some, and to be very honest, there is sugar inside of here, but we just have more. The gradient's greater out here, so it's going to go this way. From high to low, go with the flow. So SS goes in, what's going to be pulled out always goes off. Right, so you see that is the pattern. If the solute goes in, the water comes out. So now we have this little raisin.
And that's how dry fruit is made.
Right. You just don't, you may or may not add something other than just some heat or whatever. Beef jerky is another example about how they make that. All the spices and stuff, and it just pulls the water out and spices move in.
Okay. So, yeah, the Dead Sea. It's supposed to be like a really salty lake, right? Does that have anything to do with diffusion? Or am I just...
It's more of that, well, we call it more evaporation because the substances aren't moving across the membrane.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about membranes here. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. All right, so piece of lettuce. Here's lettuce leaf, a lettuce cell. All right, so let's say you're making a sandwich or a salad. A piece of lettuce just falls in the. Here it is, and it falls on the counter, and you forget about it. You're like, oh, maybe I can still revive it. But before you do that, what does it look like? Like, from right out of the refrigerator, might be nice and crisp. So this central vacuole actually might be even bigger than that. It's pretty full. So lots and lots of water. But if we just leave it out on the counter, what's going to happen to it?
It's gonna, yeah.
All right, so what happens first?
It dries up.
Why though?
Because
Osmosis, water seeps through, and as it leaves, the straight up osmosis, no diffusion, it's going to get all wrinkly, right? And kind of shriveled up. But if you catch it in time, you can put it in cold water and it'll fill the vacuole back up.
I never knew that.
So when you go to the grocery store, they'll spritz the vegetables. All they're doing is filling the vacuoles back up.
We should watch Osmosis.
Maybe after our exam. We always watch a movie afterwards.
Do you hear anything else I got
No.
Speak loud.
Louder.
You know how you strawberries, right? You put sugar on it and it becomes like liquid something.
Okay, so you tell me. So you have strawberries, you put all the sugar on top. Hypertonic, so on the outside, because of all that sugar diffuses in, pulls the water out, and it makes the juice. Okay.
What are you talking
Okay, last thing, real quick. All right, we're going to draw. All right, 3 beakers with 3 red blood cells. So this is real. I'm going to show you the real deal on the video with real blood, because we can't do this in class just because of bloodborne pathogens. Because of bloodborne pathogens. So here's the setup. You know how your blood tastes kind of salty and metallic. Okay, so the solution in your blood is not pure water, it's salt. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this red blood cell, which is normally, this would be what you're going to see on the video, is you can prick your finger and you just add a couple blood drops to distilled water, which is plain water. So that's the first beaker. And they'll use the word distilled on your exam. So distilled just means plain old water with no ions in it at all. Okay. But because that red blood cells used to be in the salt, it has a little bit of a saltier content. So here's some salt that's naturally going to be there just because it's what it's used to. So if we put pure blood in pure water, what's going to happen to those cells? Well, I know that, but that's a BS answer. Give me something real. Come on. Tell me about diffusion and osmosis.
They're gonna mix together. Blood mixed with water.
What's going to happen to the blood cells?
They're gonna like, they're gonna dissolve this.
I think all the water's gonna go into it and explode.
Okay, so what's going to be pulled? All right, where do you have more salt, first of all?
In the water.
Inside. So the salt is going to diffuse out. Now, Patricia, tell us what you just said.
The water's gonna go in.
Okay, so water naturally comes in through the membrane, and then what's going to happen to the cell? They're going to explode. So this is why your IV fluids are not pure water. It would destroy every one of your red blood cells. It would kill you. So IV, notice on the bag, it'll say saline solution. So it has to be isotonic. It has to be equal to the blood concentration. So because this is distilled water in plain, we call it hypotonic. And it doesn't have a high solute concentration. Hypo meaning below. But this is hypertonic because it has more solute compared to the other environment. Okay, so tell me what this looks like. If we have, let's say 6 salts there, 6 salts here, how does that compare? What's going to happen if you put this blood in that liquid? This is called isotonic because iso means equal. So that is equilibrium. And so that cell, that is the IV fluid that is given to you and everything's good. Now they can always add stuff to it, but that's going to be an isotonic situation. So what happens if we're like, oh no, we're going to put these red blood cells in a real salty solution. So you take some really salty water and you add blood to it. What's going to happen now? Do you want to answer? Okay. What, Charlie?
Blood won't disperse, it'll just kind of.
All right, so hold up. Tell me about the movement first. Where do you have more salt?
Outside.
So this is hypertonic. So which way is the salt going to move? Salt goes in. What's going to be pulled out? By diffusion, hypotonic. And now you've got a little shriveled up red blood cell. So, so this is called, I think it's like crinating, and this is, this one eventually is going to explode. So that one is cytolysis. Okay, yes, ma'am.
So like your cells like recognize the difference between like different types of like I don't want to say like water because like just like different like completely different types of water, but like I guess drinks, I guess, and
Okay, so because remember water's it's a mixture like in a drink. Let's say that it's Sprite, and we put the red blood cells in Sprite. Well, there's more sugar on the outside because it's all it is dispersed. So if all of us in this room was a solution, say half of us were water, the other half were sugar that in the flavoring, all we are in a mixture is just moving against each other. We're not combining. So those molecules can move in. Some of them don't. So it just depends on what it is.
So if you're like if it's something like soda, I guess, and you like throw something like back or social, but like we'll like.
Are you asking about like your cells?
Yeah. Like,
what I think what's so bad about the soda is all the artificial flavoring, and plus carbonated water is an acid. It actually messes up. It corrodes everything. So, okay. All right. So let me show you this real fast, and then we're gonna get your All right, where is this? I think my computer's not doing it. All right, how many folks do we have? 16, 17. Okay, so we're gonna have 4 groups in a minute. We'll have 3 groups of 4 and 1 group of 5. Okay. So what we're gonna do is actually number off today. You're not gonna choose your group. It's a lot easier because we can move a lot faster. So let me give you all the choices.
Looking good.
Okay. Red blood cells, salt versus blood, diffusion, and a great race.
That's good.
Okay, so let me go ahead and we'll get into groups and then I'll pull this up and you can see it at the end of class because I don't want to waste any time. Okay, so we're going to number off. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, I'm not listening.
That's fine. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. Okay, you know your number? All right. So, what you're going to do is 1, 2, 3, and 4, just because that's where the numbers are on the stations. And go to yours, and then you send somebody to draw your skits.
I got 1.
I got 4.
Okay.
Where's number 3?
What number are you?
What number is this?
That's 3. Should be 2, right? Did 2 didn't get 1, right? Yep. All right. So you have to make props. You may have to make a costume. I have big bulletin board paper to make like stuff. So all right. So y'all are the molecules. You have a narrator to choose.
I'll be the narrator. I called it.
But you all probably going to be needed to actually show it. Our paper over there. Do we have three copies? Okay. All right. Usually we have about 15 minutes to plan. There's some white, some plain paper in here. You want to sketch ideas out or like.
You guys come up with the rest.
You guys can make name tags and things like, anybody need bulletin board paper? So the room is.
She said she wanted to be
Okay.
Let you do them, bro.
You know, it hurts. And it doesn't
So like, is that, are the golf balls up?
I'm still working on it.
Okay. So I guess.
I know it's like weird. So pretty. And then he go my hair. And then
Where are the scissors?
So you say you're gonna be there? I don't know.
What does she say?
You're slow.
I'm making a slug.
People don't talk to me. What is that? My lung.
I got look too.
this looks great. Someone tell me this.
Let's find some cake.
Oh, who won Dave?
Nope.
Look at her looking like a, yes, looking like a snack, yes. I know, but I hate how the dress is like, it actually like, that makes me mad. Back. Oh, yeah, oh, she gave her something.
I guess you can cut that out.
I need some kids,
So I gotta make that back. All right. Linda, can you show that to me?
Yeah.
I know I gotta make it look like a bunny, but I don't want to.
Yeah, my whole stomach was on camera.
And then we're gonna go on here.
We're gonna try this.
I don't hear. I think this one even here.
Yeah, but you that means back.
We all had great experiences.
I know they did.
He doesn't need it.
That's a whole song.
Y'all need to be tall.
It's like a weird. Those are the worst ones.
I don't. Why?